It's Lutterloh pattern time again, and today we're drafting a blouse to perfectly fit our bodies. The pattern that I'm using is pattern 108 from supplement 307 winter 2017-2018. This is a perfect summertime pattern, a blouse that consists of a front, back, and a neckband piece. And I've added a button closure to the back neckline. I've also added bias binding around both of the armholes and an invisible zipper in one of the side seams. I hope you join me today in this very satisfying self-drafted personalized project. Let's get started. Here we have the pattern I'm sewing, top 108 from my binder, and I've made a copy and cut the main pieces. I'll start with the front piece using my bust measurement first of 80 centimeters to transfer all of the dot markings above and including the waist dots. Then I'll change to my hip measurement of 88 centimeters to transfer the remaining dots below the waist. Using rulers, I'll connect all of the dots, and I'll also transfer the dart, grain line, slit, and zipper notches. The neckband pattern piece is extracted from the front piece, meaning I'll trace it out, transfer the markings, add seam allowance, and cut it out. So now I have a standalone piece. Then I'll add seam allowance to the front bodice only. I'm adding 1/2 inch seam allowances and a 1 1/4 inch hem. I'll cut out this piece, and all we have left is to do the back piece. We do this exactly as we did the front, transferring the dots, connecting them, adding labels and seam allowance, and then cutting it out. Now I can cut out my fabric and neckband interfacing and also grab a zipper. Let's sew. Here is one of my front bodice pieces, and I'm going to pin my dart. And I'll do this for both front bodice pieces. Then I'll sew the darts from the outside edge to the point, leaving thread tails at each point so I can tie them in knots. And press your darts downward. Now for the sides and the center fronts, I'm going to finish the raw edges using my serger. Doing this for both pieces. Place your front bodice pieces right sides together. Then we'll pin from the notch to the bottom of the garment. Now I'll sew from the notch to the bottom of the garment with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, back stitching at both ends to secure. Then I'll press the entire seam allowance open from top to bottom, including the top unsewn portion. Now the center front seam is sewn and pressed from top to bottom. And we're going to top stitch around the slit. I'm just going to be edge stitching close to my finishing stitches, and when I get to the bottom of the slit, I'll stitch straight across and back up along the finishing stitches on the other side. We're going to attach the two back bodice pieces together in the same exact way. First, finishing the center and side edges separately, then placing the back bodice pieces right sides together, and then pin and sew from the slit to the bottom of the garment. Then press your seam allowance open and top stitch around the slit. Then we can place our front and back bodice pieces right sides together, and then pin one of the side seams. Sew your pinned side seam with the seam allowance that you added to this project. Again, mine is 1/2 inch. Now here I have one of the side seams sewn and pressed open, and we're going to be attaching the invisible zipper to the opposite side seam. First, I'll open my zipper and take it to the ironing board to gently press open those coils. With the back bodice pieces still right sides together, I'll pin the first 2 inches. And I'll sew this 2 inch portion with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, back stitching at both sides to secure. Now that top portion of the underarm is sewn, I'll place my zipper tape right sides together with the bodice. The outside of the zipper that's right sides together with the bodice should be facing the outside of the garment, and your opposite zipper tape should be facing the inside of the garment. Since my seam allowance is 1/2 inch and my zipper tape is also a 1/2 inch wide, I'm going to match the outer edge of the zipper tape with the finished edge of the garment. and I want my top zipper stop to start at the end of my stitches. And I'm going to pin from the top of the zipper to the bottom of the zipper. Now I'll sew this side of the zipper tape in place from top to bottom with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, sewing as far to the bottom of the zipper as I can get. Now we have half of the zipper installed, and we're going to attach the other side of the zipper tape to the other side of the seam. Once again, making sure that the top zipper stop is at the bottom of your stitches, and align the outer edge of the zipper tape with the finished raw edges, pinning from top to bottom. Sew close to the zipper teeth with that 1/2 inch seam allowance from top to bottom, once again sewing as far to the bottom of the zipper as possible. Now that the zipper is fully installed, I'll go ahead and close the zipper, and I'll pin the remainder of the side seam from the bottom of my zipper stitches to the bottom of the garment. With my zipper foot still installed, I'll start my stitches at the end of my zipper stitches and sew with that 1/2 inch seam allowance to the bottom of the garment. For this pattern, I'm choosing to omit the armhole facings and use bias tape instead. From my main fabric, I've cut 1/2 inch wide single fold bias tape, one for each armhole. Now I'll open out the blouse so that the entire armhole is right sides facing me. And I'll open out one of the raw edges of the bias tape so I can place that raw edge right sides together with the entire armhole. You can pin the binding in place if needed. I'm going to be placing the raw edge of the bias tape 1/4 of an inch away from the raw edge of the bodice armhole as I stitch in the pre-pressed 1/4 inch fold of the bias tape. I'm going to be stitching from the top of one bodice piece around the armhole to the top of the opposite bodice piece. I'll go ahead and trim my armhole seam allowance all the way around. And I'll turn that bias binding to the inside of the garment, turning it to the inside right along the seam that we just sewed, so that now the opposite folded edge of the seam allowance gives us a nice clean finish on the inside. Now that my binding is pressed to the inside of the garment, I'm going to edge stitch close to the opposite folded edge of my binding all the way around the armhole. Repeat for both armholes. Now that the armhole bindings are attached, cut off any excess binding that extends beyond the top of the bodice. Apply interfacing to the wrong side of one of the neckband pieces. Then I'm going to draw my seam allowance around the inner edge. And for the outer edge of this interfaced piece, I'm going to press the seam allowances to the wrong side by 1/2 of an inch all the way around. Place the two neckband pieces right sides together and pin along the inner edge. Then we can sew along the inner edges along the line that we traced onto the fabric. I'm going to trim this seam allowance by about 1/2. And I'll clip into the curves, careful not to clip through the stitching line. Now I'm going to understitch the facing. I'm going to turn the facing over its seam allowance. Sew the facing to the seam allowance about 1/8 of an inch away from the original stitching line. Place the neckband pieces wrong sides together and give the neckline a good press. Now that that's pressed, I've also pressed the outer back neckline edges, pressing those seam allowances to the inside by 1/2 inch. Now starting with the front bodice piece, I'm going to start attaching the neckband. I'm going to place the center of the uninterfaced neckband piece right sides together with the front bodice and pin in place from peak to peak. And sew in place with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So here is the seam allowance that I just sewed, and I'm going to trim it by 1/2 and then clip into the curves. Now I'll pin the back of the neckband to the back bodice in the same way. Making sure that for this back section, the seam allowance of the neckband extends beyond the slit by 1/2 inch. On both sides. Then continue pinning on both sides of the slit to the peaks. And sew in place with a 1/2 inch seam allowance on both sides just as we did for the front. And then I'll trim those seam allowances just as I did for the front. And I'll also clip those curves. For the back button loop, I'm going to use a remnant piece of bias binding and fold this single fold bias tape in 1/2. And then I'll edge stitch close to the open edge. Fold the button loop in 1/2 to make sure that you have a loop that's big enough for your button to fit through, plus seam allowance, and clip off the excess. Now starting at one of the back neckline upper edges, I'm going to fold my neckband wrong sides together so that the pre-pressed edge of the interfaced neckband sits on top of our seam line. And I'm going to tuck to the inside the vertical seam allowances of the neckband edge. And I'll pin in place along the slit. Now I'll take my button loop and fold it in 1/2 and place the raw edges in between the neckband piece. And pin in place. Then I'll continue pinning the neckband wrong sides together around the entire neckline. Once again, the bottom edge of the inner neckband sits on top of the seam line, and tuck the vertical neckband seam allowances at the opposite back edge to the inside. And pin in place all the way around. For the shoulder sections of the neckband, tuck under the seam allowance of the uninterfaced piece so that it perfectly aligns with the pre-pressed edge of the interfaced piece, and pin in place. And do this for the shoulders on both sides. Now my neckband is pinned all the way around and I'm ready to stitch in the ditch from the outside seam. As we stitch in the ditch, we will be catching the inner folded edge of the neckband as we go. And as we approach both of the shoulders, we're simply going to edge stitch along the folded edges. Lastly, for the neckbands where they meet the center back slit, we're going to edge stitch vertically along both edges, primarily to secure the button loop. And then sew on your button across from the button loop. For the bottom hem of the blouse, I'm going to fold the bottom raw edge to the wrong side twice. First by 1/4 inch, and then once more by 1 inch. Once I have that hem pressed to the inside, I'll edge stitch close to the upper inner fold all the way around. And now the blouse is complete. Thank you for watching this sew-along. Make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future full-length sew-alongs, and I'll see you in the next video.